Mediator went very still. She set her pen down on the table slowly, like she was buying herself time, and looked at my father's lawyer in a way I hadn't seen anyone look at another person in a long time. "Are you certain," she said, "that you want to proceed with this characterization on record?" The lawyer didn't answer right away. Neither did my father. I kept my hands flat on the table and said nothing. "I should start earlier than that room. I should start with the house on Elgin Crescent, the one with the big silver maple out front that used to drop helicopters all over the driveway every fall. My father used to make me rake them up on Saturday mornings, every single one. If I missed any, he'd come out and point. 'You do a job, you finish it,' he'd say." I was 7 the first time I heard that. I heard it until I was 18 and left for university in Halifax. I heard it so many times I started saying it to myself before he could say it to me, like a preemptive strike. My parents divorced when I was 11. My mother moved to Kelowna and I stayed with my father because she was sick. Not catastrophically, but enough that living with a child wasn't something she could manage. My father never let me forget that decision. Not cruelly, not loudly. Just in the way he'd sigh when I asked for things. The way he'd say, "Your mother," with a particular flatness that meant she left us both, in different ways. He remarried when I was 15, his wife. I'll call her what she always introduced herself as, which was your father's partner, had 2 sons from her previous marriage. One was my age, one was a year younger. They moved into the house on Elgin Crescent. Suddenly, I was raking maple helicopters alone while 2 teenage boys watched from the porch. I want to be fair. She wasn't cruel to me. She just treated me like a tenant in a house she was renovating. Polite. Distant. Occasionally inconvenienced by my presence. My father seemed relieved by the arrangement. I finished high school. I got a scholarship, partial enough to matter, and went to Halifax for my undergrad in nursing. I called home on Sundays. The calls got shorter every year. When I graduated, my father did not come. His partner had a work event. The boys had hockey. He sent a card with a $50 bill inside and wrote "proud of you" in handwriting I recognized as stiff and effortful, like the sentence cost him something. I put the $50 toward my first month of rent in a basement apartment in Dartmouth and didn't call home for 2 months. I worked in emergency for 3 years in Halifax, then transferred to a trauma unit in Toronto. The work was brutal and specific, and I was good at it in a way that surprised me every time, not because I doubted my training, but because the part of the job that breaks people, the nights when you lose someone, when a family comes apart in the waiting room, when you have to be steady inside a chaos that has no edges, that part didn't break me. It steadied me instead. I called my mother more than my father. She'd gotten better by then, managed her illness well, lived in a nice little condo near the lake in Kelowna with a garden on the balcony. She always asked about my work. She asked specific questions. She remembered the names of colleagues I'd mentioned once months earlier. My father asked if I was seeing anyone. The years went by the way years do when you're busy. I worked. I moved up. I took a position as charge nurse, then as a clinical educator, and eventually I was pulled into a program with Health Canada, working on emergency preparedness protocols for northern and remote communities in Ontario and Nunavut. I traveled. I did training in places with no roads in and no cell service, and I learned how to land a float plane and how to suture a laceration with minimal equipment in a room with no heat. My father, when I eventually told him what I did, said, "That sounds exhausting. Why don't you find something closer to home?" He meant Edmonton. He and his partner had moved there a few years earlier for her work. The boys were both in the city. There were grandchildren now, which I heard about mostly through a Facebook page I followed but never posted on. I did not find something closer to home. My grandmother died in March, the year I turned 32. She was my father's mother. She was 87 and sharp until the end, and she had always been quietly, consistently in my corner in a way that nobody ever acknowledged out loud. She used to call me on my birthday at exactly 7 in the morning. She sent newspaper clippings in the mail. When I published a paper in a nursing journal, it was a small journal, a technical piece about triage protocols in resource-limited settings. She cut out the abstract, which I had sent her, and framed it. I flew to Edmonton for the funeral. I had not been back in 4 years. My father hugged me at the door of the funeral home with a hug that lasted about 3 seconds. His partner nodded at me. The boys, men now, really, shook my hand. Their wives were polite. The grandchildren ran around the lobby, and nobody made me feel like I had any particular claim to being there. At the reception afterward at my father's house, I overheard his partner telling someone that the estate would stay within the family. She said it in the kitchen. She didn't know I was in the hallway. I stood there for a moment. Then I went to find a glass of water. My grandmother's estate was not large. The house in Red Deer had been sold years ago. What remained was a modest amount, saved over a lifetime. I later learned it was approximately $240,000, and a collection of things, furniture, jewelry, a set of china, a painting of the Bow River that had hung in her living room my entire life. She had written the will. She had written it clearly. I know this because she had told me about it on the phone 2 years before she died. She'd said, "I've made sure it's done properly. You're in it, sweetheart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I thanked her. I told her I didn't care about money. She said, "I know you don't. That's part of why." My father called me 6 weeks after the funeral. He said there was a situation with the estate and that they'd had some conversations and that it would be best if I agreed to a simplified distribution that would keep things straightforward. Straightforward how? I asked. He paused. The boys have families, kids. It makes more sense for the assets to go somewhere they'll be used. I said, "Grandma named me in her will." He said, "Things change. She wrote that will years ago. She would have wanted what's best for everyone." I said I'd need to speak to the estate lawyer directly. He sighed. "That same sigh, the one from when I was 7. He said, "I don't want this to become a thing." I said, "I don't either." The estate lawyer was a woman in Red Deer who had worked with my grandmother for many years. When I called her, she read me the relevant section of the will carefully and without editorializing. My grandmother had left me 40% of the liquid assets and the painting of the Bow River. The remainder went to my father. The lawyer said she had already received calls from my father's partner inquiring about options. I asked what kind of options. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you should have your own representation." I hired a lawyer in Toronto. Her name isn't important. What matters is that she was methodical and unimpressed by posturing, which was good because the posturing that followed was significant. My father filed a challenge to the will on grounds that my grandmother had not been of sound mind when she made her decisions. He submitted a letter from a doctor, not her regular physician, who was retired, but a walk-in clinic doctor she had seen once for a sinus infection, suggesting she had shown signs of confusion at that visit. My grandmother had been doing the Globe and Mail crossword in pen 3 weeks before she died. My lawyer called the challenge frivolous. The other side did not withdraw it. We were, somehow, going to mediation. I drove to Edmonton on a Wednesday in October. The leaves were down and the sky was that flat white prairie sky that I had forgotten about, the one that feels like it's been stretched over the world too tight. The mediation was held at a firm in the downtown core. We were in a boardroom on the 14th floor. My father was there with his partner and their lawyer. I sat across from them with my lawyer beside me. My father looked older than I'd expected. He sat with his jacket on and didn't take it off the entire time. His partner had a notepad and kept writing things on it and passing it to the lawyer. I looked out the window at the river valley. The trees were bare. Before the session formally opened, while we were still doing the procedural setup, my father's lawyer said something about the nature of the claimant's relationship to the deceased. He was speaking in that particular legal adjacent way that means nothing specific but implies everything. He referenced my absence from family events, my geographic distance, my limited involvement in the care of the deceased. My father nodded while the lawyer spoke. He did not look at me. Then the lawyer, I don't know if he meant to or if he was just on a roll, said that my grandmother's attachment to me had always seemed somewhat sentimental rather than practical, and that a woman largely absent from the family should not be prioritized over those who had actively participated in her care and her life. My lawyer started to respond. The mediator held up a hand. That's when the mediator set her pen down. She looked at the other lawyer steadily and said, "Are you certain you want to proceed with this characterization on record?" The lawyer said, "I'm simply presenting the family's position." "I understand what you're presenting," the mediator said. "I'm asking whether you've done your due diligence on the characterization of your opposing party." The lawyer looked uncertain. "I don't follow." The mediator folded her hands. She turned to me. "Would you like to speak to your background and your relationship with the deceased?" "For the record." I said I would. I didn't perform it. I didn't have notes. I just said what was true. I said that I had called my grandmother every Sunday for 12 years without exception, that when she was hospitalized in 2019 for a hip replacement, I had taken a week of leave and flown to Red Deer to be there for the surgery and the first days of recovery because my father had said he couldn't get away, that I had been the one to help her transition to a smaller apartment after the house was sold. I had driven a rental truck, I had organized her things, I had sat with her on the floor of her empty living room while she talked about my grandfather, that I had arranged and paid for a personal emergency response system after she had a fall in 2021 that nobody else in the family found out about until I called and told them. I said that she and I had spoken at length about her wishes, that she had made her will clearly and deliberately, that the suggestion she had been confused or manipulated was not only legally unfounded, but personally an insult to a woman who had been one of the sharpest people I had ever known. I stopped talking. The room was quiet. My father's partner was no longer writing on her notepad. My father was looking at the table. The mediator turned to the other lawyer and said, calmly, "I'd recommend a brief recess." During the recess, I stood in the hallway and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and looked at a piece of abstract art on the wall that I couldn't make any sense of. My lawyer came and stood beside me. She said, "They're going to withdraw." I said, "You think?" She said, "The care documentation you have, the phone records, the receipts from the apartment move, and the PERS device, their doctor's letter was never going to hold. They knew that before today." I asked, "Then why are we here?" She was quiet for a second. Sometimes people just need to try. When we went back into the boardroom, the other lawyer confirmed that his clients wished to withdraw the challenge and proceed with distribution as written. My father's partner looked at her notepad. My father looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in that morning. He had the expression of someone who had expected a door to be locked and found it open and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or afraid. I didn't say anything. The mediator thanked us all. The paperwork was initialed. My lawyer and I rode the elevator down in silence. Outside, on the street, the wind came off the river valley, cold and direct. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute before hailing a cab. My lawyer put on her scarf and said, "Good day." I said, "Yeah." I didn't go back to my father's house. I booked a hotel the night before, already knowing, I think, that the day would end this way. I ordered dinner to the room and sat on the bed and called my mother. She answered on the second ring the way she always does. I told her what had happened, not every detail, just the shape of it. She listened without interrupting, which she has always been good at. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have said something very dry right now, something perfectly chosen." I laughed. It surprised me. I hadn't expected to laugh. "She would have," I said. My mother said, "I'm sorry it had to happen this way." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. The word "all right" felt insufficient and also accurate at the same time, which is maybe what all right always is. "I think so," I said. "I'm tired." "Then sleep," she said. "You always figure out the rest better when you're not tired." My father called me 3 weeks later. I was in a community outside of Timmins doing a training session with a regional health authority. The call came in at 7 in the evening while I was eating a sandwich in my rental car in a parking lot. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. He said, "I wanted to call." I said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down sideways. I watched it hit the windshield. He said, I don't think I handled the last few months well. I said, no, you didn't. He said, I let things get away from me. I should have talked to you directly. Instead, I let other people make decisions that should have been mine to make. I didn't say anything. I let him continue. She loved you, he said. My mother. She really did. I knew that. I don't know why I let myself. He stopped, started again. I think I've been, for a long time, not very good at knowing what I actually want versus what I'm being told I should want. It was more self-awareness than I'd heard from him in 32 years. It didn't fix anything, but it was real and I could tell it cost him. I said, I know she loved me. That's why I wasn't going to let it go. He said, I know. I said, I'm not angry at you. I'm not anymore. But I also need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend the last 20 years didn't happen just because one conversation went differently. He said he understood. I said, I'd like to try, but slowly, on my terms too. He said, that's fair. The snow was really coming down now. The parking lot lights made it glow orange. I said, I have an early start tomorrow. He said, of course, I'll call again if that's okay. I said, that's okay. The painting of the Bow River hangs in my apartment in Toronto, in the hallway, where I see it every time I come home. She had it for as long as I can remember. The artist isn't anyone famous. It's unsigned, actually, something she'd bought at a market in Calgary in the 1970s. It's not worth anything in particular. But it's the first thing I see when I walk through the door. That flat, wide water. The light coming in from the left, the far bank, with its line of trees just beginning to show autumn. I don't know what my grandmother thought when she decided to leave it to me. I'd like to think she knew exactly what she was doing, the way she always did. That she knew I'd put it somewhere I'd see it every day. That she was trusting me to carry something forward, even if neither of us ever put it into words. Some things don't need to be said. She knew that. She taught me that, actually, over 12 years of Sunday phone calls and newspaper clippings and a framed abstract in a journal no one outside the field had ever heard of. I didn't leave because she failed me. I just went out to do the work that was mine to do. And I came back, in the end, carrying everything she gave me. I keep thinking about my grandmother's hands. The way she held a pen, the way she'd underline things in the newspaper that she wanted to remember or wanted to tell me about later. She was careful with the things that mattered to her. She didn't waste precision on anything she didn't mean. That's what I held on to when my father's lawyer sat across from me in that boardroom and suggested I had been largely absent. I didn't argue in that moment. I didn't raise my voice or pull out a phone and start reading off dates. I just waited. Because I had learned, somewhere along the way, that the truth doesn't need you to fight for it the same way a lie does. A lie needs noise. The truth tends to just sit there until the room gets quiet enough to hear it. What happened in that mediation wasn't luck. It wasn't some accident of timing or a fortunate turn. It was the result of something much simpler and much harder. I had shown up. For 12 years, I'd shown up, not because I expected anything in return, but because she was my grandmother and I loved her and she needed someone who would actually call on Sunday. Those phone calls were not strategic. The week I took off work to be with her after her hip replacement was not calculated. The emergency response device I arranged after her fall, nobody knew about that. Nobody was watching. I did it because it was right, and because it needed to be done, and because I was the one who knew about it. That's the thing about doing what's right when no one is watching. It leaves a record anyway. Receipts. Call logs. The memory of a woman who noticed, even if she never said it in those exact words, she said it in her will instead. Clearly. Deliberately. In the hand of someone who is not confused. My father made a choice, and that choice had consequences, not as punishment. I don't think life is that tidy, but a simple cause and effect. He had spent 20 years assuming I would always be at a distance. That distance meant absence. That absence meant I could be overlooked. What he didn't account for was that distance had never stopped me from doing the work. I had just been doing it quietly, without an audience, in the way that felt honest. And I think that's the part that really got to him in that boardroom. Not losing. The recognition that he had misread me entirely. That the daughter he'd written off as peripheral had been the one, the whole time, who actually showed up. I don't tell this story to make my father look small. He called me 3 weeks later and said things I hadn't heard from him in 32 years. That matters. People can change, or at least shift, if something cracks the version of the story they've been telling themselves. What I carry forward from all of it is something my grandmother modeled her whole life without ever naming it. She was a person of genuine integrity. Not the performed kind, not the kind you announce, but the kind that just quietly organizes how you spend your time and who you show up for. She thought carefully about what was fair, and she had a spine made of something harder than sentiment. Those are the things worth building in yourself. The willingness to do right by people even when it costs you something. The clarity to understand what's actually true versus what's convenient. And the stubbornness, the good kind, to keep going when the people who should have believed in you didn't. The painting is in my hallway. I see it every morning. That's enough.